A mysterious horse appears in a storm to guide a lost child. Where it leads them and why will leave you in disbelief. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun filtered through the ancient redwood trees, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. Shadow, a majestic black stallion, moved with purpose through the wilderness. His hooves pressed silently against the soft earth, navigating between fallen logs and dense undergrowth with practiced ease. The horse's muscles rippled beneath his sleek coat as he maneuvered through the natural obstacle course of the forest. Shadow paused near a small stream, his ears twitching at the sounds of the forest coming alive. Birds called from the branches above, and small creatures rustled through the underbrush. He lowered his head to drink, maintaining awareness of his surroundings. A survival instinct developed over years of living wild in these woods. The peaceful morning shattered with a distant cry. Shadow's head snapped up, water droplets falling from his muzzle. His ears swiveled forward, catching the sound of distress echoing through the trees. The cry came again, closer this time, a human voice, young and frightened. Through the dense foliage, a small figure stumbled between the massive redwood trunks. It was a boy, no more than 10 years old, his clothes dirty and torn from pushing through the undergrowth. Tommy's face showed clear signs of exhaustion and fear. His eyes were red from crying, and his voice grew hoarse from calling out repeatedly for his mother. The boy's movements became more erratic as panic set in. The towering redwoods seemed to close in around him, their massive trunks creating a natural maze that only heightened his disorientation. Tommy's breathing came in short gasps as he spun around, trying to find any familiar landmark in the endless sea of trees. Shadow observed the scene from a distance, his natural instincts telling him to retreat from human contact. Yet something about the boy's distress held his attention. The horse remained partially hidden behind a thick trunk, his dark coat blending with the shadows of the forest. Tommy sank to his knees, overcome by exhaustion and fear. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he pressed his hands against the forest floor, feeling the cool earth beneath his fingers. The boy's vulnerability stirred something in Shadow. The horse took a tentative step forward, his hoof cracking a fallen branch. The sound made Tommy freeze. He slowly raised his head, his breath catching in his throat as he spotted the magnificent creature emerging from the shadows. Shadow stood perfectly still, his muscles tense and ready to flee if necessary. The morning light caught his coat, revealing hints of deep blue undertones in his black fur. Time seemed to stop as boy and horse regarded each other. The forest fell silent, as if nature itself held its breath to witness this unlikely encounter. Shadow's nostrils flared as he caught the boy's scent on the breeze, while Tommy remained motionless, afraid that any sudden movement might frighten away this magnificent creature. The horse took another careful step forward, his curiosity gradually overcoming his caution. Tommy stayed on his knees, his fear momentarily forgotten as he watched the animal's graceful approach. Shadow's hooves made barely a sound on the forest floor, his movements controlled and deliberate. The distance between them slowly decreased, each step bringing these two lost souls closer together. The morning light continued to filter through the canopy above, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the clearing. Neither human nor horse fully understood the significance of this moment, but both felt the weight of it. As Shadow drew near, Tommy could see his own reflection in the horse's deep, intelligent eyes. The animal's presence brought an unexpected calm to the boy's panic-stricken mind. In this peaceful moment, surrounded by the ancient redwoods, a connection began to form, one that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. The clearing remained still as Tommy slowly raised his hand, palm facing upward. His movements were careful and deliberate, despite his heart hammering in his chest. Shadow regarded the outstretched hand with cautious interest, his ears flicking forward and back as he assessed this new development. The distance between them shortened inch by inch. Shadow's breath came in warm puffs against Tommy's palm, sending tingles of anticipation through the boy's arm. When the horse's velvet muzzle finally made contact with his skin, Tommy released a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This simple touch sparked something within Tommy, a surge of hope that broke through his earlier despair. His fingers trembled slightly as they made contact with Shadow's soft nose. The horse didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch, encouraging the connection. Finding courage in this acceptance, Tommy began to speak. His voice was quiet at first, barely above a whisper, as if afraid to break the spell of the moment. "I've been at the orphanage for 3 months now," he confided, his words carrying the weight of unspoken loneliness. Shadow's ears remained focused on the boy's voice, his dark eyes fixed on Tommy's face. As Tommy continued to stroke Shadow's muzzle, his story spilled out in a rush of words. He spoke of endless nights in a dormitory filled with other children, yet feeling completely alone. He described the well-meaning but overworked staff who barely had time to learn the children's names, let alone their stories. His voice cracked as he mentioned the couples who visited, always choosing other children, never him. Shadow remained perfectly still throughout Tommy's confession, as if understanding the importance of this moment. When tears began to roll down the boy's cheeks, the horse lowered his head further, allowing Tommy to lean against his strong neck. The warmth of Shadow's body provided comfort that Tommy hadn't experienced since losing his family. "Sometimes I think about running away," Tommy admitted, his words muffled against Shadow's coat. "But I don't have anywhere to go." The horse responded with a soft, nickering sound, gentle and reassuring. Tommy found himself smiling despite his tears, interpreting the sound as understanding. Gradually, Tommy's tears subsided, replaced by a growing sense of peace. Shadow took a small step backward, creating enough space to gesture with his head toward a narrow path through the trees. The invitation was clear, even to Tommy, who had never spent time around horses before. Standing up on shaky legs, Tommy wiped his face with his sleeve. Shadow waited patiently, his tail swishing gently against his flanks. When Tommy took an uncertain step forward, Shadow matched his pace perfectly, neither rushing ahead nor lagging behind. Together, they began to walk along the forest path. Shadow's presence beside Tommy felt natural, as if they had known each other for years rather than minutes. The horse seemed to understand instinctively when Tommy needed to rest, stopping at convenient fallen logs or smooth rocks. As they walked, Tommy continued to share snippets of his life. He told Shadow about his favorite books in the orphanage library, about the little garden he had started behind the building, and about his dreams of having a real family again. Shadow listened to it all, occasionally offering soft sounds of acknowledgement that made Tommy feel truly heard for the first time in months. The forest around them seemed to embrace their newfound companionship. Sunlight danced through the leaves above, creating patterns that shifted and changed as they walked. The earlier sense of being lost and trapped had disappeared, replaced by a feeling of discovery and possibility. Tommy found himself, penning up about things he had never told anyone. His fear of the dark, his secret habit of naming the stars he could see from his dormitory window, the way he sometimes pretended his parents were just away on a long trip. Shadow's steady presence beside him made these confessions feel safe, his secrets protected by the ancient trees surrounding them. As Tommy and Shadow ventured deeper into the forest, they came upon a small clearing where a family of deer grazed peacefully. The doe lifted her head, ears alert but not alarmed by their presence. 2 spotted fawns stayed close to their mother, their large eyes studying the unlikely pair with innocent curiosity. Tommy instinctively slowed his pace, remembering to breathe softly as Shadow had seemed to teach him during their walk. The horse remained calm beside him, and the boy noticed how the deer responded to Shadow's relaxed demeanor. Instead of fleeing, the deer family continued their morning routine, accepting the presence of both horse and human. "They're beautiful," Tommy whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. He had never been this close to wild animals before. The tender way the mother deer nuzzled her fawns made his heart ache with a familiar longing, but the pain was different now, softer, more bearable with Shadow by his side. A flash of movement caught their attention as a snowshoe hare bounded into the scene. Its brown fur had patches of white remaining from winter, making it look somewhat comical. The rabbit showed no fear, hopping playfully between Shadow's legs and circling around Tommy's feet. A laugh escaped Tommy's lips, the first genuine laugh he'd experienced in months. The hare's antics continued, drawing circles around the clearing and occasionally pausing to stand on its hind legs, whiskers twitching comically. Even Shadow seemed amused, following the creature's movements with gentle interest. The deer watched the impromptu performance with tilted heads, the fawns occasionally stamping their tiny hooves in what appeared to be delight. As they stood in the clearing, Shadow began teaching Tommy the subtle language of the forest. The horse's ears would twitch toward specific sounds, the soft rustle of leaves that signaled a squirrel's passage, the distant tap of a woodpecker, the whisper of wind through the high branches. Tommy found himself becoming attuned to these small details, discovering a world he had never noticed before. A gentle breeze carried the sound of running water to their ears. Shadow led Tommy toward the source, their path winding between ancient tree trunks. The boy noticed how the forest floor changed beneath their feet, from soft pine needles to springy moss, from bare earth to patches of tiny wildflowers. Tommy reached out to touch the rough bark of a redwood, feeling the deep grooves beneath his fingers. Shadow waited patiently as the boy explored, seemingly understanding the importance of these discoveries. When a shaft of sunlight broke through the canopy, Tommy noticed how the dust motes danced in the golden beam, creating what looked like falling stars in the daytime. The sound of water grew louder, and Tommy found himself drawn to its rhythm. Shadow showed him how to step carefully over exposed roots and around delicate ferns. Each step revealed new wonders: a cluster of bright mushrooms growing at the base of a tree, a delicate spider web jeweled with morning dew, the intricate patterns of lichen spreading across fallen logs. Together they discovered a small stream, its clear water dancing over smooth stones. Tommy watched, fascinated, as tiny fish darted through the shallows, their scales catching the light. Shadow demonstrated how to approach the water quietly, lowering his head to drink without disturbing the stream's residents. Following Shadow's example, Tommy knelt beside the stream. He dipped his fingers into the cool water, feeling the gentle current flow around them. A water strider skated across the surface nearby, its movements precise and graceful. The boy found himself smiling at the tiny insects dance, appreciating these small moments of natural beauty that he had never noticed before. The forest had transformed from a frightening maze into a world of endless discoveries. Through Shadow's guidance, Tommy was learning to see the woodland as a living, breathing community rather than just a collection of trees. Each sound, scent, and sight held new meaning, telling stories that Tommy was only beginning to understand. Through a break in the trees, the gray stone building of Miss Clara's orphanage emerged into view. The three-story structure stood surrounded by well-tended gardens, with smoke curling from its chimney into the late afternoon sky. Window boxes filled with colorful flowers softened the building's stern facade, and a wooden swing set in the side yard suggested warmth and care despite the institution's formal appearance. Tommy's steps faltered as they drew closer to the orphanage. His hand instinctively reached for Shadow's mane, fingers curling into the coarse hair for reassurance. The horse remained steady beside him, offering silent support as memories washed over the boy. He remembered his first day at the orphanage, the overwhelming smell of pine cleaner, the echo of footsteps in long hallways, the sound of children's voices bouncing off stone walls. The weight of his small suitcase had seemed to grow heavier with each step up those worn entrance stairs. That day, every door closing behind him had felt like another barrier between him and his old life. Shadow sensed Tommy's hesitation and gently nudged the boy's shoulder with his nose. The gesture was gentle but firm, seeming to say, "I'm here with you." Tommy took a deep breath, drawing strength from his new friend's presence. The horse's quiet confidence helped steady his racing thoughts. As they stood at the edge of the forest, Tommy noticed details about the orphanage he'd never seen before. The afternoon light caught the stained glass window above the entrance, casting rainbow patterns on the ground. The garden beds he'd been helping to tend were starting to show signs of life, with tiny green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Movement at the front door drew their attention. Miss Clara appeared, her gray hair neatly pinned back and her practical dress covered by a worn apron. She paused at the top of the steps, shading her eyes against the sun as she scanned the grounds. When she spotted Tommy, her face transformed with relief. Unlike the stern headmistresses from storybooks, Miss Clara's face held genuine warmth. She began walking toward them, her pace quick but careful not to appear threatening. Tommy felt Shadow tense slightly beside him, but the horse held his ground, assessing the approaching woman. "Tommy," Miss Clara called out, her voice carrying notes of both concern and relief. "We've been worried sick about you." She slowed her approach when she noticed Shadow, her eyes widening slightly at the magnificent animal standing protectively beside the boy. Miss Clara stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped in front of her apron. "I see you've made a friend," she said softly, her eyes taking in the unusual pair. There was no judgment in her voice, only genuine interest and understanding. "This is Shadow," Tommy found himself saying, his voice stronger than he expected. "He helped me when I was lost." The words felt inadequate to describe the connection he'd formed with the horse, but Miss Clara's gentle smile suggested she understood more than he could express. "Then we owe Shadow our thanks," she replied, addressing both boy and horse with equal respect. She took another step forward, moving slowly and deliberately. "Tommy, I know these past months haven't been easy, but I want you to know that you have a place here with us, for as long as you need it." The sincerity in her voice made Tommy's throat tight with emotion. "Shadu Lubarati's head to gently bump against the boy's shoulder, offering silent support. Miss Clara noticed this interaction, and her eyes softened further. "Perhaps," she suggested carefully, "your friend could visit sometimes? We have that meadow behind the kitchen garden that's never used." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds, the structured safety of the orphanage and the wild freedom Shadow represented. Tommy felt something shift inside him at these words. The orphanage had always felt like a temporary stop, a place he was passing through. But Miss Clara's words, combined with Shadow's steady presence, suggested the possibility of something different, a way to belong while keeping a connection to his newfound freedom. From his position at the forest's edge, Shadow observed the daily routines of the orphanage with watchful eyes. His powerful frame remained partially hidden among the trees, but his attention never wavered from the building where Tommy now spent his days. The horse's heart carried a mixture of emotions. Joy at seeing Tommy find safety, yet a lingering sadness at their necessary separation. Days turned into weeks, and Tommy's visits became a cherished routine. Every afternoon, when classes and chores were finished, the boy would appear in the meadow behind the kitchen garden. Sometimes he carried an apple or carrot saved from lunch, but Shadow seemed to appreciate Tommy's presence more than any treat. During one visit, Tommy sat cross-legged in the grass, enthusiastically sharing stories about his day. "I got full marks on my mathematics test," he announced proudly, pulling the paper from his pocket to show Shadow. The horse lowered his head to inspect the red marks of approval, nickering softly as if expressing congratulations. "Miss Clara says I have a natural talent for numbers," Tommy continued, absently braiding strands of long grass as he talked. "She thinks I could even teach some of the younger kids." Shadow listened attentively, his ears focused on Tommy's voice, sharing in the boy's growing confidence. Their afternoon meetings became a blend of conversation and exploration. Tommy would tell Shadow about the other children at the orphanage, how he was starting to make friends, especially with a quiet girl named Sarah who shared his love of books. Shadow would respond with gentle nudges and soft sounds, encouraging Tommy to open up about his experiences. One particularly memorable afternoon, they discovered a small stream cutting through the meadow. Shadow approached the water with familiar ease, demonstrating to Tommy how to spot the silvery flash of fish beneath the surface. The boy watched, fascinated, as Shadow's movements caused minimal disturbance to the water. "Can you teach me?" Tommy asked, his voice eager but uncertain. Shadow responded by stepping back, creating space for Tommy to approach the water's edge. The horse's presence remained close, offering silent guidance as Tommy learned to move slowly and keep his shadow from falling across the water. Their first attempts at fishing were clumsy, with Tommy's excited movements sending the small fish darting away. But Shadow's patience never wavered. The horse would nudge Tommy's arm gently, encouraging him to slow his movements, to become part of the stream's natural rhythm rather than disrupting it. As the sun moved across the sky, Tommy's technique improved. His hands became steadier, his movements more deliberate. When he finally managed to cup a tiny fish in his hands for a brief moment before releasing it, his face lit up with achievement. Shadow's soft whinny seemed to celebrate the success with him. These quiet moments by the stream became special lessons, not just in fishing, but in understanding the natural world. Tommy learned to read the water's movement, to spot the places where fish might hide, to feel the connection between all living things that Shadow seemed to understand instinctively. The other children at the ORP. Heartwarming noticed changes in Tommy. He carried himself differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from these afternoon sessions with Shadow. When younger children struggled with fears or loneliness, Tommy found himself sharing wisdom learned from his equine friend, about patience, about finding peace in nature, about the strength that comes from true friendship. Miss Clara observed these changes too, often watching from the kitchen window as Tommy and Shadow spent their afternoons together. She saw how the unlikely friendship was healing something in the boy that no amount of human care had been able to reach. The horse's steady presence seemed to anchor Tommy, giving him the security he needed to begin truly settling into his life at the orphanage. The late afternoon sky darkened without warning, transforming from clear blue to threatening gray. Tommy and Shadow had ventured deeper into the forest than usual, exploring a dense section they hadn't visited before. The first distant rumble of thunder made them both pause, Shadow's ears flicking nervously toward the sound. Thick clouds rolled in rapidly, blocking out the sun and casting the forest in a premature twilight. The wind picked up, causing the massive redwood branches to sway and creak ominously above them. Tommy felt the first heavy drops of rain hit his face as Shadow moved closer to him, their usual roles beginning to reverse as the boy sensed his friend's growing unease. "It's okay," Tommy said softly, reaching up to stroke Shadow's neck. He could feel the horse's muscles trembling beneath his touch. Despite his wild nature, Shadow showed a distinct fear of storms, a vulnerability that made Tommy feel needed in a way he'd never experienced before. The storm intensified quickly. Lightning flashed through the canopy, followed by deafening thunder that seemed to shake the forest floor. Shadow reared slightly, his hooves pawing at the air, but he fought his instinct to flee. Instead, he remained close to Tommy, who was searching for shelter. Through the increasing downpour, Tommy spotted a massive redwood with broad, low-hanging branches. "There," he pointed, guiding Shadow toward the natural shelter. The horse followed, trust overcoming fear as they made their way through the strengthening storm. Under the ancient tree's protection, they found relative safety. The thick canopy above them filtered the worst of the rain, creating a sanctuary from the chaos. Tommy positioned himself beside Shadow, speaking in low, soothing tones as another thunderclap boomed overhead. "Count with me," Tommy whispered, remembering how Miss Clara had taught him to handle his own fear of storms. 1, 2, 3. He counted steadily between lightning and thunder, showing Shadow how to measure the storm's distance. The horse's breathing gradually steadied, matching the rhythm of Tommy's counting. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the sharp crack of breaking branches. Shadow pressed closer to Tommy, his large body shielding the boy from the occasional gusts that penetrated their shelter. In this moment of shared vulnerability, their bond deepened, each protecting the other in their own way. Tommy began telling stories to distract them both, his voice barely audible above the storm. He spoke about the books he'd been reading, about the constellations he'd learned from Miss Clara, about his dreams of someday having his own stable where scared horses could find safety. Shadow listened intently, his fears seeming to subside as he focused on Tommy's words. As the storm raged on, they developed a rhythm of mutual comfort. When thunder shook their shelter, Tommy would stroke Shadow's neck and count steadily. When the cold wind cut through Tommy's thin jacket, Shadow would shift position to block it, sharing his warmth. They were no longer just friends but partners, each understanding and responding to the other's needs. Gradually, the storm's fury began to ease. The thunder grew, more distant, the wind less fierce. Rays of late afternoon sun started to pierce through breaks in the clouds, creating steam where they touched the rain-soaked forest floor. The world around them had been transformed by the storm's passage. When they finally emerged from their shelter, they found a changed forest. Fallen branches littered the ground, and new streams had formed where the rain had carved paths through the earth. But amidst the disorder, signs of resilience emerged. Birds tentatively resumed their songs, and droplets of water caught the returning sunlight like thousands of tiny prisms. The familiar sound of Shadow's neigh echoed through the forest, but something was different this time. The usual strong, confident call had been replaced by a tone of distress. Tommy, who had been helping in the orphanage garden, dropped his tools immediately. He knew his friend's voice as well as he knew his own name, and this call set his heart racing. Without hesitation, Tommy sprinted toward the sound, his feet carrying him automatically along the paths they'd explored together. The urgent neighing continued, guiding him deeper into the forest. His lungs burned as he ran, ducking under branches and jumping over fallen logs, but he didn't slow down. When Tommy finally reached the source of the cries, his heart nearly stopped. Shadow stood tangled in a dense thicket of blackberry brambles. The thorny vines wrapped around his legs and body. The horse's black coat was marked with small cuts where he had struggled against the thorns, and patches of his mane were caught in the twisted branches. "Shadow," Tommy called out, approaching carefully to assess the situation. The horse's eyes showed fear, but also relief at seeing his friend. Shadow had apparently tried to push through what looked like a shortcut, only to become hopelessly entangled in the thorny undergrowth. Tommy's mind raced as he surveyed the scene. The brambles were thick and vicious, their thorns like tiny hooks designed to snag and hold. Shadow's struggling had only made things worse, causing the vines to wrap tighter around his legs. One wrong move could cause serious injury. Drawing upon everything Shadow had taught him about staying calm in difficult situations, Tommy took a deep breath. He remembered their time during the storm, how counting had helped them both remain steady. 1, 2, 3, he whispered, organizing his thoughts. First, Tommy needed to calm Shadow completely. He approached the horse's head, speaking in soft, reassuring tones. "I'm here now. We'll figure this out together." Shadow's breathing slowed as he focused on Tommy's voice, just as he had done for Tommy so many times before. Tommy began examining the tangled vines methodically, starting with those around Shadow's legs. He noticed that pulling directly on the brambles only caused them to tighten and dig deeper. Instead, he needed to follow the vines to their source and work backwards. Using careful movements, Tommy began breaking the brambles at their bases, where they were thicker but less thorny. His hands got scratched in the process, but he barely noticed the pain. His entire focus was on freeing his friend, using the patience Shadow had taught him during their fishing lessons. The work was slow and meticulous. Tommy talked continuously to Shadow, explaining each move before he made it. "I'm going to break this vine now. Stay still for just a moment longer." Shadow seemed to understand, remaining remarkably calm despite his predicament. When one particularly stubborn vine caused Shadow to flinch, Tommy remembered how the horse had helped him overcome his fears in the forest. Now it was his turn to be the steady one, the protector rather than the protected. He worked with renewed determination, ignoring the sweat dripping down his face and the thorns pricking his hands. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Tommy managed to clear enough of the brambles for Shadow to carefully step fr. The horse emerged from the thicket slowly, testing each step to ensure no vines remained attached. Despite the small cuts covering his coat, Shadow appeared more relieved than injured. As the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, Tommy led Shadow to their favorite clearing, a peaceful spot where wildflowers dotted the grass and the ancient redwoods created a natural sanctuary. Shadow moved somewhat stiffly from his encounter with the brambles, but his eyes remained bright and alert. Tommy guided his friend to a soft patch of grass, where Shadow could rest comfortably. The boy sat cross-legged beside the horse, his scratched hands resting in his lap. The event of the rescue had left him feeling different, stronger somehow, more capable. For the first time, he had been the protector rather than the protected. "I'll always come when you need me," Tommy promised softly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He reached out to gently stroke Shadow's neck, carefully avoiding the small cuts from the thorns. The horse lowered his head to Tommy's level, their eyes meeting in a moment of perfect understanding. Shadow's response came in the form of a gentle nicker, followed by a soft nudge against Tommy's shoulder. This gesture, so familiar now, seemed to carry its own promise, one of continued protection and friendship. The horse's eyes held a depth of emotion that Tommy had come to recognize over their time together. As they sat in companionable silence, Tommy noticed how the clearing had changed since their first meeting. Spring flowers were giving way to summer growth, and new birds had arrived with their distinctive songs. He had learned to identify many of these changes thanks to Shadow's patient guidance. Shadow shifted position, stretching out his legs and shaking his mane free of the remaining twigs. The movement reminded Tommy of their journey together, how far they'd both come from that first fearful encounter in the forest. The horse no longer showed any signs of his previous wariness around humans, at least with Tommy. The peaceful moment was interrupted by a distant bell, the orphanage's dinner signal. Tommy felt his heart grow heavy as he remembered Miss Clara's announcement from that morning. The orphanage was planning a summer trip to the coast, a rare treat for the children. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, created a knot in his stomach. Shadow seemed to sense the change in Tommy's mood. The horse raised his head, ears forward, waiting for Tommy to share what was troubling him. This had become their routine, Shadow always knowing when Tommy needed to talk, offering silent support until the words came. "They want us to go on a trip," Tommy finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To see the ocean." He plucked absently at the grass beside him, struggling to express his conflicted feelings. The prospect of seeing the ocean for the first time was exciting, but the thought of leaving Shadow, even briefly, filled him with anxiety. Shadow remained still, listening as he always did when Tommy needed to work through his thoughts. The horse's steady presence helped Tommy find the words to voice his fears and hopes. He spoke about wanting to experience new adventures, but feeling torn about leaving the safety and comfort he'd found in their friendship. The clearing grew quieter as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the trees. Tommy knew he needed to return to the orphanage soon, but he couldn't bring himself to move just yet. This moment felt important, a turning point in their relationship. In response to Tommy's unspoken anxiety, Shadow made a series of soft, reassuring sounds. These gentle vocalizations seemed to say what words couldn't, that their bond wouldn't be broken by temporary separation, that true friendship transcended physical distance. Tommy spent his last scheduled day before the trip in the forest with Shadow, his heart heavy with mixed emotions. The morning light painted everything in soft, golden hues, making each moment feel more precious. He had deliberately woken up earlier than usual, sneaking out just as dawn broke over the orphanage roof. Shadow was waiting in their usual meeting spot, as if he understood the significance of this day. The horse's familiar silhouette against the morning mist brought a lump to Tommy's throat. Since their first meeting, they hadn't been apart for more than a day, and the upcoming separation loomed large in Tommy's mind. As they walked their familiar paths, Tommy found himself memorizing every detail. The way Shadow's hooves left perfect prints in the soft earth, the specific sound of his breathing when he was content, the gentle swish of his tail against the undergrowth. Each observation felt important to preserve like photographs in his mind. "Everything's different now," Tommy said softly, more to himself than to Shadow. He thought about how much his life had changed since their first encounter. The frightened, lonely boy who had felt lost in these woods was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident. Shadow had been instrumental in that transformation. They visited all their special places, the stream where they'd learned to fish together, the clearing where they'd weathered the storm, the patch of wild berries they'd discovered on one of their adventures. At each stop, memories washed over Tommy like waves, both comforting and bittersweet. Shadow seemed to understand the importance of their journey, moving at an unhurried pace and stopping whenever Tommy needed a moment. The horse's usual playfulness was replaced by a gentle attentiveness, matching his young friend's contemplative mood. As they rested beneath their favorite redwood, Tommy began talking about his hopes and fears. "What if everything's different when I come back?" he asked, voicing the worry that had been gnawing at him. "What if you're not here anymore?" Shadow responded by pressing his nose against Tommy's chest, right over his heart, as if to say some connections couldn't be broken by distance. Tommy shared stories about his life before the orphanage, things he'd never told anyone else. He spoke about his parents, about the home he'd lost, about the dreams he still carried. Shadow listened as he always did, offering comfort through his steady presence and gentle touches. The afternoon light began to shift, signaling that their time together was growing short. Tommy felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against his chest. He had grown so much since finding Shadow, learned about courage, about friendship, about belonging. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, made him feel like that scared little boy again. With trembling fingers, Tommy reached up to wrap his arms around Shadow's neck. The horse lowered his head, allowing the embrace. "I'll never forget what you've taught me," Tommy whispered into Shadow's mane. "About being brave, about trusting, about finding your way when you're lost." Their connection had grown beyond simple friendship. Shadow had become a guide, a protector, a bridge between Tommy's past and present. Through their time together, Tommy had learned not just about survival in the forest, but about thriving in life despite its challenges. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the trees, Tommy knew their day was coming to an end. The impending separation felt both impossible and necessary, a test of the strength they'd built together. Shadow's gentle nickering seemed to carry a message of reassurance, a promise that their bond would endure. The morning of the trip arrived with a flurry of activity at the orphanage. Children rushed about with packed bags, their excited voices echoing through the halls. Tommy stood on the front steps with his small suitcase, watching Miss Clara count heads and check lists. His mind, however, kept drifting to the forest's edge. A familiar sound caught his attention. Not Shadow's usual call, but something different, more urgent. The noise came from deeper in the forest, accompanied by unfamiliar human voices. Tommy's heart began to race. Without thinking, he set his suitcase down and moved toward the tree line, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. As he entered the forest, the voices became clearer. Professional, focused voices discussing coordinates and search patterns. Through the morning mist, Tommy made out figures in uniform moving methodically through the trees. Their presence here in Shadow's territory filled him with both curiosity and concern. Following the sounds, Tommy came upon a scene he never expected. A small group of people dressed in wildlife management uniforms stood in a clearing, examining maps and discussing locations. Their conversation stopped when they noticed him, and a woman with kind eyes stepped forward. "Hello there," she said gently. "You must be Tommy. Miss Clara mentioned you might be around here." She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Martinez, head of the local wildlife rehabilitation program. "We've been looking for a very special horse," she continued, watching Tommy's reaction carefully. Tommy's world shifted as Dr. Martinez explained that Shadow was actually part of a rehabilitation program for injured wild horses. He had been receiving treatment for an old injury when he escaped their facility months ago. They had been searching for him ever since, worried about his well-being. As Tommy processed this information, a soft neighing drew everyone's attention. Shadow emerged from the trees, moving with the same grace Tommy had always known, but something was different. The horse approached the group without his usual caution, clearly recognizing Dr. Martinez and her team. "He looks healthier than when he left us," Dr. Martinez observed, her professional assessment tinged with admiration. "And he seems to have found exactly what he needed." She smiled at Tommy, who stood frozen between his friend and the rehabilitation team. The truth began to unfold like a flower opening in sunlight. Shadow hadn't just been a wild horse who befriended a lost boy. He had been healing himself while helping Tommy heal too. Their paths had crossed at exactly the moment when they both needed someone to trust, someone to help them find their way. Dr. Martinez explained that they had been planning to release Shadow back into the wild once he was fully recovered. However, seeing the bond between boy and horse, she proposed a different solution. The rehabilitation center had a program where recovered horses could be adopted by carefully selected families. "We've been watching," she admitted. "Miss Clara told us about your special friendship. She's been keeping us updated on both of you." The revelation that Miss Clara had known all along suddenly made sense. Her willingness to let Tommy spend time in the forest, her gentle encouragement of his bond with Shadow. As Tommy stood trying to process everything, Shadow moved to stand beside him, just as he had done countless times before. The horse's presence felt different now, not less special, but more complete. Understanding Shadow's full story somehow made their connection even more meaningful. "Sometimes," Dr. Martinez said softly, "healing happens in unexpected ways." Shadow needed to find his own path to recovery, and it seems he found exactly what he needed in you, Tommy. She paused, letting her words sink in. "Would you like to help us continue his rehabilitation? Officially this time?" The morning sun broke through the canopy, illuminating the clearing. Tommy looked at Shadow, seeing his friend in a new light, not just as a wild creature who had chosen to trust him, but as a fellow survivor who had helped him find his own path to healing. Their story wasn't ending. It was transforming into something new, something even more remarkable. Miss Clara appeared at the edge of the clearing, smiling knowingly. The trip to the AST could wait. Something more important was happening here, a new chapter beginning for both boy and horse, one that would combine the freedom of the wild with the security of belonging somewhere, to someone. In this moment of revelation, Tommy understood that sometimes the most powerful connections come disguised as chance encounters, and that healing often happens when we're busy helping others heal themselves.